Well, welcome to the 700 Club. The biggest snowstorm in a decade is hitting parts of central and eastern United States. From the Great Plains to the Atlantic coast, as many as 63 million Americans are on alert.
Well, in Washington, D.C., federal offices are closed, but still, Speaker of the House Mike Johnson declared the storm won't stop Congress from certifying the presidential election today. Dale Hurd has the story.
The first major winter storm of the year is dumping historic amounts of snow and ice across multiple states, from the central U.S. to the mid-Atlantic. Kansas and Missouri face blizzard conditions, with Kansas City, Missouri getting 11 inches, the fourth highest one-day snowfall total on record. This state trooper showed how fast the snow was falling.
We've got a lot of drifting. I mean, this is my patrol car. If we get right here, you can see how much is just sort of building up around the vehicle.
On Interstate 70 in eastern Illinois, cars and trucks slid off the road in this pileup. More than 1,000 drivers were stranded in Missouri yesterday alone, and at least one person was killed in a weather-related crash. Louisville, Kentucky got over 7 inches of snow, breaking the old one-day record set in 1910. And in Cincinnati, some vehicles were stranded for more than 7 hours on Interstate 71 after several semi-trucks got stuck in the snow.
I just yelled down to one of the drivers who was standing there, who got out to basically stretch his legs, and I yelled at him and I said, "Hey, how long you been here?" He said 3 hours. That was an hour ago, and there's still been no movement.
The storm also brought damaging winds to the deep south with tornado warnings in Arkansas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. After the snow, Arctic air is forecast to move into much of the east. Washington, D.C. could see up to a foot of snow, the most in 9 years, and federal offices will be closed today. However, before the storm hit, Republican House Speaker Mike Johnson said bad weather would not delay Congress's certification of Donald Trump's election victory.
Because, as you know, the Electoral Count Act requires this on January 6th at 1 p.m. So whether we're in a blizzard or not, we are going to be in that chamber making sure this is done.
Lawmakers will gather at noontime today under tight security to prevent any disruption like happened in 2020. And even if the snow prevents some members from attending, Congress does not need full attendance to count the votes. Dale Hurd, CBN News.
We're going to certify a president today, but tomorrow will be a whole nother issue. And I would encourage you, as that cold weather comes in, what's going to happen is there'll be an absolute sheet of ice everywhere, whether it's rain or snow today, it'll be ice tomorrow. So please, stay home, stay off the roads. Don't go anywhere unless you absolutely have to. In other news, 3 Israeli citizens died in a terror attack in the West Bank this morning. As the war continues, concerns are rising that the Biden administration is trying to use the United Nations to weaken Israel. CBN's Julie Stahl reports from Jerusalem.
In its final days, the Biden administration is said to be considering a new anti-Israel resolution in the UN Security Council that would undermine President-elect Trump's Middle East policy. Michael Doran, co-host of the Hudson Institute's Israel Update podcast, describes how the resolution might happen.
There will be an official finding by the State Department that Israel is in violation of 620I. It's blocking humanitarian aid to Gaza.
The Security Council would then take that finding as evidence it needs to pass a new resolution punishing Israel. The U.S. would reportedly abstain in the vote on the resolution so it would pass, and then the world bodies like the International Criminal Court would use it to condemn and weaken Israel.
This resolution and the American official finding will be used by the ICJ, the ICC, etc., against Israel.
What we're looking at here is fear that they'll use these 18 days to undermine Trump and his ability to move forward with his own Middle East policy and to further damage Israel's standing in the international arena.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken is now admitting that the Biden administration's pressure on Israel has emboldened Hamas. He told the New York Times that every time Hamas saw the U.S. squeeze Israel, the terror group backed off from a hostage deal.
Whenever there has been public daylight between the United States and Israel and the perception that pressure was growing on Israel, we've seen it. Hamas has pulled back from agreeing to a ceasefire and the release of hostages.
Negotiations for a ceasefire and hostage release are moving slowly. Hamas has reportedly agreed to release 34 hostages, but the terror group is demanding a week-long ceasefire so it can determine which ones are still alive and how many are dead. This weekend, the terror group released a video of IDF soldier Liri Albag, held hostage in Gaza now almost 460 days. Her parents talked to top Israeli leaders after the video came out.
And we told them to make a deal. This is the time. There's Liri and 99 other hostages who need to return home quickly.
They also told Israel's Channel 12 News the video released today ripped our hearts to shreds, and they asked it not be made public. In his interview with The Times, Blinken said Hamas is responsible for the hostages' continued captivity and questions why world leaders aren't putting more pressure on the terror group.
For all of the understandable criticism of the way Israel has conducted itself in Gaza, you hear virtually nothing from anyone since October 7th about Hamas. Why there hasn't been a unanimous chorus around the world for Hamas to put down its weapons, to give up the hostages, to surrender. I don't know what the answer is to that.
Meanwhile, the war continues on other fronts. This morning in Samaria, also known as the West Bank, terrorists fired on an Israeli bus, killing 3 Israelis and wounding 9 others. Julie Stahl, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Well, our CBN Middle East Bureau Chief, Chris Mitchell, is in the United States, and he's with us right now on set. So, Chris, I've got to piggyback on what our Secretary of State just said. He said it's understandable to criticize Israel in the conduct of the war. I'm listening to that, and I'm going, you've got to be kidding me. Yeah. What in the world is he talking about?
Well, what Israel has done in the prosecution of the war, according to John Spencer, military historian, Israel has done more than any other military in modern history to protect civilian lives. And also talking about this finding about humanitarian aid, they have provided hundreds of thousands of tons of food, medical supplies into Gaza that actually has been used by Hamas to fight their war by selling it on the black market, getting food, and using it as a leverage against their own people, the Palestinian people.
I assume Blinken understands that the same critique could be made against U.S. soldiers in how they went to war with Iraq or went to war with Afghanistan. That the same things happen in a battle zone.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that was the point that Israel's been making since the beginning of the war. You know, they lament all the Palestinian casualties, but they're doing everything they can. They tell Palestinians to get out of harm's way. They tell them where they're going to attack, get to a humanitarian zone and get out. So this telegraphs to Hamas exactly what Israel's going to do. And so this actually puts not only Palestinian lives at risk, but also Israeli soldiers. And that's something that I've heard from Israelis, that they're just concerned. What the U.S. has been doing, pressuring Israel, is putting their own soldiers at risk and throughout the prosecution of the war.
Well, let's also talk about, you know, when there's, to use Blinken's term, when there's daylight between Israel and the United States, where it appears publicly that there's some disagreement with them as to what to do. That actually emboldens Hamas and stops any kind of negotiation and release of hostages. And they say, well, okay, if we just hold on and continue this, we can isolate Israel.
Well, that's exactly part of Hamas's strategy. And much of the public daylight has come from the U.S. side. That's how many people in Israel perceive it, that the Biden administration has really been putting pressure on Israel. They've actually started to undermine or started to undermine the Biden administration. You saw that Senate Majority Leader at one time, with the White House permission, asked for a change of leadership. So the public daylight had been coming from the Biden administration in many ways and fit into Sinwar, the leader of Hamas's strategy. It was actually discovered in some of their documents that they wanted to divide not only the Israeli public, and they used the hostages to do that, but also between Israel and the United States.
And Israel in the world, and Europe,
Yes,
and
yeah.
UN. I mean, the list goes on. It's all part of the grander strategy.
Yeah.
They were hoping Hezbollah would come in force. They were hoping Syria would come in. They were hoping Iran would come in.
Yeah.
And they were trying to ignite the entire Middle East.
Yeah.
Let's talk about an obscure thing. It's called 620I. What exactly is that, and how? I mean, I hear loud and clear Carolyn Glick in that piece, but others are saying, Israel, watch out. There's about to be a Biden surprise, somewhat similar to what Obama did in his last month in office.
Yeah, that was Resolution 2334, which actually said that all Israeli, quote-unquote, settlements were illegal, and that would include Jewish Quarter,
Right, the Jewish Quarter,
the Temple Mount, the Western Wall. So this finding is that if anybody is found keeping humanitarian aid away, the U.S. can limit military aid to that country, and that would be Israel. So the finding would actually be brought reportedly before the UN Security Council. The U.S. may abstain, just like they did in 2016, which would open the door for criticism, demonization of Israel, and from the International Criminal Court to the International Court of Justice. And one of the keys, Gordon, I think, is whether or not it would be under Article 6 or 7 under the UN Charter. Article 6 is that, the anti-resolution would go against Israel. However, Article 7 carries the weight of actually force and sanctions. So that would be critical in case this ever does get to the UN Security Council.
Well, it seems to be a duality in U.S. foreign policy. On the one hand, let's take 620I and try to demonize Israel, saying you're withholding humanitarian aid from Gaza. And so therefore, we're now going to withhold aid from you. At the same time, he just said $8 billion in weapons going to Israel. So the U.S. is not going to act on the finding at all.
Yeah.
It's not going to change anything in our behavior to Israel. But I've got to ask the larger question: why in the world would you want to put Israel at a disadvantage at the UN?
Yeah, it's a question I think a lot of people have asked. Why has the Biden administration been against Israel? I think they've had a sort of a schizophrenic policy towards Israel since October 7th. On the one hand, they want to support Israel publicly. On the other hand, there's a limited arms embargo. There's statements that Israel is not prosecuting the war and not providing humanitarian aid. And if you look at the way that Israel has provided humanitarian aid, they've provided hundreds of thousands of tons of food into the Palestinian people, really against their own, which actually many people believe, and military experts say, that actually lengthened the war, that actually put Israeli lives more at risk, and the Palestinian lives, and lengthened what has been Israel's longest war in its history.
It's also against U.S. interests because U.S. citizens are hostages.
That's right. That's right.
And so, again, I'm puzzled. Why in the world would you do this? It literally makes no sense.
Yeah.
You're not even representing your own country anymore.
Yeah, I remember a few weeks ago, Gordon, you asked actually us in the Jerusalem Bureau to have the names and the faces of all the 8 Israeli-American hostages. And I think throughout the prosecution of this war, the fact that there are Americans there almost 460 days now in captivity, it's kind of been lost, I think, on the American public. I think that's a reflection on the Biden administration not making it clear that there are Americans involved, Americans in hostages, maybe in some tunnel in Gaza right now. So that seems to be part of this lack, I think, of resolve to make sure that Americans would be safe. I would expect, based on what President-elect Trump has done in 2016 to 2020, they're going to be a focus in this new administration of those Americans.
I've got to say, isn't it also an indictment of American media? You know, I remember the Iranian hostage, and so the Iranian government took our embassy personnel, held them hostage. And a whole nightly news program came out of it.
Began that way.
I mean, so there was a steady drumbeat. And then during the Bush administration, every single broadcast every news broadcast started or ended with how many American soldiers had died in the war in Iraq. And that was the lead up to the 2008 election. If there had been anybody other than Biden in office, would the American media have changed the narrative on the hostages held by Hamas?
Yeah, you would think so. And like you said, you refer to Nightline. Ted Koppel, famously, that's how his show began about the Iranian hostages. I think that would have made a huge difference if people knew day by day, week by week, that Americans were being held hostage within the... And it would make a change, I think, on the blame being on Hamas, not Israel, during this war.
I don't want to get too political with it because Carter was a Democrat and so Bush was a Republican, and it just seems the narrative has changed. But let's look at administration policy. Carter, after he left office, seemed to be increasingly against Israel.
Very much so.
Clinton, I have to give him credit. He was very pro-Israel, and when he proposed to Arafat a Palestinian state and that was rejected, he's been very consistent in the past 2 years to say, look at what they rejected.
Yeah.
And that should open your eyes as to what their ultimate goals are. They had it all. They could have had a Palestinian state. They could have had East Jerusalem. They could have had all of that, and they turned it down. But then you get Obama, and now you have Biden. And it seems to be a very anti-Israel and even setups at the UN in order to demonize the state of Israel.
Yeah.
I've got to ask, why? Why would you do that to an ally?
It seems like there's an element, and I think there's, as we talked about, a schizophrenic policies, perhaps from the White House or the State Department. Reportedly, there are people that are opposing this potential UN resolution. It seems to be probably an element, perhaps, of anti-Semitism, an anti-Israel focus that they want to somehow, maybe at the very last minute, give it to Israel and make it harder for the Trump administration coming in and to demonize Israel in the light of the World Forum.
All right, well, let's turn to the page. What's Israel expecting Trump to do?
Well, first of all, I think the big thing they'll be expecting is Iran. Right now, it seems like more than ever that Iran is weakened. And I remember for years, your father, Pat, used to ask me, is Israel going to do it? Are they going to attack? I think it's more likely now than ever before for a couple of reasons. First of all, Iran's anti-air defense system is down. And now Syria's air defenses have been destroyed by Israel. So the way forward militarily looks good. In terms of weakened Iran, Hamas has been defeated, Hezbollah, the Houthis are weakened as well. And it seems like internally, they're really on the back foot. And it might be the time for the Trump administration at least to give the green light, if not actually help Israel go ahead and destroy Iran's nuclear facilities. And that could lead to a regime change because there's so much opposition within the country itself against the mullahs after 40 years plus of this tyranny.
Are we on the verge of an historic victory? I mean, I see Hezbollah has been dismantled. Hamas is on its last legs. Syria has changed. I'm worried about the new government.
Yeah.
I'm worried that they're radically oriented. They have said they want to conquer Israel and conquer Jerusalem. But if Iran, is this an incredibly, historic victory?
If you look at what happened from October 7th to today, I think people would call it a miracle. Hamas has been defeated almost totally. Hezbollah as well, which was the main nemesis on Israel's border. And now Iran itself may fall. People, I think, would say they couldn't believe how bad it was on October 7th to today. I think it could be considered miraculous. And as you said about Syria, that may be the next big threat on the horizon, and Turkey as well. And in terms of Syria, I think it's important to pray for Christians right now who are perhaps increasingly under the threat of Sharia law. there in
it's
Syria.
going to be ISIS in Iraq all over again. They're going to go after the religious minorities,
Really,
whether they're Christian or Druze. Or they're going to act just like ISIS acted in northern Iraq.
I think people need to realize that's what's coming. You know, they're talking a good game right now, but the way they're acting on the ground. Give you one example. There in Aleppo, they're asking for Christian women to wear the hijab. I think that's a portent of things to come.
Spiritually, you're a watchman on the wall. What's God telling you?
I think that there's historic changes going on in the Middle East. Nations are shifting. If you look at what Jesus said about nations rising up against nations, we're seeing that in the Middle East. We're seeing the rise of Turkey. We're seeing the fall, perhaps, of Iran, at least temporarily. I think also in Israel, I see people more turning to God, an increased faith in God since October 7th. And I think we are looking on the cusp of even greater changes, perhaps, than what we've seen in the last 14, 15 months.
And you'll be on the front lines reporting all of it. Chris, thanks for being with us. And I'm being wrapped really hard by my line producer. We could talk for a long time.